In 1976, a bearded engineer named Nolan Bushnell sold his garage company to Warner Communications for $28 million. 6 years later, that same company was the fastest-growing corporation in American history, worth over $2 billion, generating more revenue than movies and music combined. Then, in the span of just 18 months, it imploded so violently that it dragged the entire video game industry down with it. Truckloads of unsold cartridges were buried in a New Mexico desert under a layer of concrete. Engineers walked into meetings to find their bosses snorting cocaine off mahogany desks. A single failed Christmas season wiped out $3 billion of market value and erased an entire industry for nearly 3 years. This is the story of Atari, the empire that fell faster than any company in tech history, and the boardroom decisions that turned a cultural revolution into the most expensive corporate cautionary tale of the 20th century. To understand how Atari fell, you have to understand how impossibly high it rose. In 1972, Nolan Bushnell was a 29-year-old engineer with a beard, a habit of holding meetings in hot tubs, and an obsession with a primitive computer game he'd seen at a Stanford lab. With his partner Ted Dabney and $500, he founded a company in Sunnyvale, California, naming it after a term from the Japanese board game Go. Their first product was Pong. It was a white dot bouncing between two white paddles. It was also a phenomenon. The very first Pong machine, installed in a bar called Andy Cap's Tavern, broke after 2 days because the coin slot was so jammed with quarters that nothing else would fit. Within a year, Atari was selling thousands of arcade cabinets, and Bushnell was building a corporate culture unlike anything corporate America had ever seen. Engineers worked barefoot, marijuana smoke hung in the hallways. Friday afternoon meetings were held around kegs of beer. One young employee, a prickly, long-haired hippie named Steve Jobs, was so unpleasant to coworkers that Bushnell had to put him on the night shift, where he secretly subcontracted his work to his friend Steve Wozniak. By 1975, Atari had pulled off something even bigger than the arcade. They miniaturized Pong into a home console you could plug into your television. Sears ordered 150,000 units. Atari sold every single one. But Bushnell had a problem. To build the next product, a programmable home console with interchangeable cartridges, he needed capital, and the venture community of 1976 wasn't built to fund a hippie company that ran on hot tubs and weed. In October 1976, Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million. He pocketed roughly $15 million himself and stayed on as chairman, believing he'd found a sugar daddy who would let him keep building toys in peace. He was catastrophically wrong. Warner was a New York entertainment conglomerate run by a tough former parking lot magnate named Steve Ross, and Ross sent in a new CEO named Ray Kassar to professionalize the operation. Kassar arrived at Atari headquarters in a three-piece suit, looked at the barefoot engineers smoking joints in the conference room, and reportedly muttered that he was dealing with a bunch of, quote, high-strung prima donnas. The clash was instant and total. Kassar instituted dress codes, time clocks, and corporate hierarchies. He referred to the engineers as towel designers, comparing them to the textile workers he'd managed in his previous job at Burlington Industries. The engineers, who had built the entire product line, were furious to learn that even after creating games that earned tens of millions of dollars, they received no royalties, no credit, and no public recognition. Their names weren't even allowed in the manuals. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Kassar's corporate discipline worked. With Warner's deep pockets, Atari launched the Video Computer System, later renamed the 2600 in 1977. After a slow start, by 1979 it was the must-have Christmas gift in America. By 1980, Atari was generating $200 million in profit. By 1981, that number had doubled. By 1982, Atari accounted for more than half of Warner Communications' total earnings. It was, by every available metric, the fastest-growing company in the history of the United States. From the outside, Atari looked invincible. Inside, it was a corporate horror show. The Sunnyvale headquarters had become a place of legend for all the wrong reasons. Multiple former employees have described open cocaine use in executive offices, sales reps doing lines off boardroom tables, and Christmas parties that descended into orgies in conference rooms. Money was flooding in so fast that nobody knew where it was going. Inventory controls were non-existent. Forecasts were fantasy documents written to please Warner's New York executives. And the engineers, the people who actually built the games, were mutinying. In 1979, Four of Atari's top programmers, who collectively had created games responsible for over $60 million in sales, walked into Ray Kassar's office and demanded royalties. Kassar refused and reportedly called them, again, towel designers. Within weeks, all four had quit and founded a new company called Activision, the first ever third-party video game developer. Atari sued, Atari lost. And suddenly, anyone could make games for the Atari 2600 without paying Atari a cent. By 1982, dozens of third-party publishers were flooding the market with cartridges. Many of them rushed, broken, or barely playable. Quality control collapsed. Store shelves filled with garbage. Consumers who had no way to tell a good game from a bad one before buying started getting burned. The trust that powered the entire industry began to evaporate. But Kassar and Warner didn't see a problem. They saw record sales projections. For 1982, they forecasted 50% growth on top of an already massive base, and they bet the company on two specific products to deliver it. The first bet was Pac-Man. Atari had paid a fortune to license the arcade smash for the home console, and Kassar's team manufactured 12 million cartridges, despite the fact that there were only 10 million Atari 2600s in existence. The strategy assumed Pac-Man would be so good it would single-handedly sell millions of new consoles. There was just one problem. The home version of Pac-Man was terrible, the ghosts flickered, the maze looked wrong, the sound was a grating buzz. Consumers who bought it felt cheated. 7 million of those, 12 million cartridges, came back as returns or sat unsold in warehouses. The second bet was even worse. T, the extraterrestrial. They gave a single programmer, Howard Scott Warshaw, just 5.5 weeks to design, code, and ship the game in time for Christmas 1982. The result was a confusing, broken mess in which a low-resolution alien spent most of his time falling into pits he couldn't escape from. Atari manufactured 5 million cartridges. They sold roughly 1.5 million. The remaining 3.5 million sat in warehouses like radioactive waste. On December 7, 1982, Ray Kassar announced to Wall Street that Atari's growth would be only 10 to 15%, not the promised 50%. Warner stock collapsed 32% in a single day, wiping out $1.25 billion of value. It was later revealed that Kassar had personally sold 5,000 shares of Warner stock just minutes before that announcement. The SEC opened an insider trading investigation. Within months, he was gone. But Atari's death spiral had only just begun. Through 1983, losses ballooned to $538 million. By 1984, the loss had reached over $1 billion. The entire American video game market collapsed from over $3 billion in sales in 1982 to barely $100 million by 1985, a 97% contraction. Retailers swore they would never sell video games again. Critics declared the medium a fad that was finally over. And then there's the most infamous chapter of all. In September 1983, residents of Alamogordo, New Mexico noticed something strange. T games into a giant pit. Workers poured concrete on top of the pile to stop scavengers from digging through it. The local newspaper reported the dumping. Atari refused to confirm what was buried. For 3 decades, the Atari landfill became an urban legend, a story so absurd that many gaming historians dismissed it as myth. Then, in April 2014, a documentary crew got permission from the city of Alamogordo to excavate the site. They dug through the desert sand, broke through the concrete cap, and found exactly what the rumors had described. T cartridges, Pac-Man cartridges, and 2,600 consoles, a literal mass grave for an industry. One unearthed cartridge sold at auction for over $1,500. The burial was real, the shame was real, and the lesson was real. Warner finally sold Atari's consumer division in July 1984 to Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore, for 50 cents on the dollar in deferred payments. Effectively, they gave it away. Nolan Bushnell, the founder who'd been pushed out years earlier, watched from the sidelines as the company he built in a garage was buried in a desert. The American video game industry would not recover until 1985, when a Japanese company called Nintendo released a console called the Famicom in the United States, rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System. They had to disguise it as a toy and bundle it with a robot just to convince retailers to put it on the shelves. That is how badly Atari had poisoned the well. Atari didn't just collapse. It killed the entire industry around it, and it took a foreign competitor to resurrect what American executives had destroyed. The Atari collapse is the boardroom case study they should teach in every business school but rarely do. Because it's not a story about a bad product or a market downturn. It's a story about what happens when a creative culture is bought by a financial culture that doesn't understand it. When growth projections become more important than the products underneath them, when executives confuse market dominance with consumer trust, and when the people who actually build the things are treated as interchangeable labor instead of irreplaceable talent. Every element of Atari's death was a foreseeable consequence of decisions made years earlier in carpeted boardrooms thousands of miles from the engineers who saw it all coming. The empire didn't fall because of E.T., the empire fell because the people in charge stopped listening. And somewhere under a slab of concrete in New Mexico, 3.5 million unsold cartridges are still there, waiting to remind anyone who'll listen that the fastest rise in tech history was followed by the fastest fall, and the only thing separating one from the other was 18 months of bad decisions. If this kind of deep dive corporate autopsy is what you came here for, subscribe to Boardroom Media. We have a lot more empires to dissect.